So this was our coffee station, and somehow we all just accepted this. Our kitchen counter roughly has the square footage of a postage stamp. So eventually, the coffee maker got evicted.
You're out of here.
And for a while, we told ourselves this setup was temporary. That was several months ago. I am no master carpenter, and most of my tools are just basic tools. And honestly, I'm one bad measurement away from a complete emotional collapse. But one day I looked at this mess and then a pile of old pallets and made a terrible decision. Because instead of buying a normal coffee cabinet like a sane adult, I decided to build an entire rustic coffee bar. And somehow it actually turned out quite beautiful. So if you've ever looked at a project and thought, I absolutely have no business attempting this, perfect. You're my kind of people.
Having grown weary of the family's questionable coffee arrangement, the middle-aged DIY male begins searching for materials. Unfortunately, he has selected the heaviest pallet in the Northern Hemisphere. Rather than reconsidering his choices, he commits fully to the mistake. The suburban woodworker is not known for elegance, only determination. Like many DIY males, he possesses no blueprint, only confidence. Ah, yes, the ceremonial pencil behind the ear, a behaviour believed to increase construction knowledge by nearly 4%. With the pallet successfully subdued, the suburban craftsman begins converting random pieces of wood into what he hopes will eventually resemble furniture. Lacking formal plans, he instead relies on an ancient and highly unreliable technique: vibes. Measurements are taken, boards are trimmed. Within moments, sawdust begins spreading to areas previously believed unreachable by physics. Pocket holes are added, allowing the structure to appear significantly more professional than it actually is. Before final assembly, the craftsman performs a cautious dry fit, a process involving careful observation and several moments of silent concern. With confidence levels continuing to exceed actual qualifications, glue and screws are applied. And finally, the sacred ritual of making absolutely certain the center board is, in fact, centered. With the main structure taking shape, attention now shifts to the cabinet doors, a process involving precision cuts and several pieces of wood that were absolutely never meant to become furniture. Careful measurements are taken to determine the final width of each door panel. The individual boards are then arranged side by side, forming what can only be described as a proper plan. Right, so glue is applied, pipe clamps are tightened, and, well, the ancient ritual of persuading warped pallet wood to cooperate officially begins. Using a rubber mallet and, well, a frankly irresponsible amount of optimism, the craftsman attempts to convince the boards to become flat. Remarkably, the varying thicknesses are not considered flaws, but character. Once cured, the panels are trimmed to their final dimensions. Additional support boards are added to the rear, dramatically improving structural integrity, which is lovely news for the doors. Having spent hours wrestling twisted pallet wood into submission, the craftsman finally introduces a few pieces of proper timber, and honestly, it's a bit lovely. With renewed confidence, pocket holes are added at an alarming rate. Biologists commonly refer to this particular species as Homo DIY Getadonius, a suburban woodworker known for solving nearly every structural problem with additional screws. The frame is then carefully clamped into position before being glued and screwed together with what can only be described as cheeky levels of confidence. Remarkably, the structure is beginning to resemble an actual cabinet rather than a pile of recycled shipping materials. At this stage, morale within the workshop appears dangerously high. With the cabinet panels complete, attention now turns to the foundation. Using several retired 2x4s discovered elsewhere in the workshop, the craftsman constructs a simple support base. Not glamorous but structurally important, and rather impressively, it appears to be square. Fortunately, the workshop already contains several pallet boards salvaged from a previous abandoned project. A fate shared by, well, roughly 93% of all DIY ideas. After months of sitting quietly in the corner of the shop, the boards are finally given a second chance. And honestly, that's rather lovely. One by one, the reclaimed boards begin forming the cabinet floor. Still imperfect, still rough around the edges, but full of character. And perhaps that's the beauty of projects like this. You don't always need perfect plans, or expensive materials, or a workshop full of fancy equipment. Sometimes all it takes is the willingness to have a go, and maybe a frankly irresponsible number of clamps. And with the final board secured, the cabinet floor is complete. A slightly uneven collection of reclaimed pallet wood, which in this workshop qualifies as excellent work. To prepare for the cabinet hinges, additional support strips are carefully attached to the frame. A surprisingly responsible decision, considering everything we've witnessed thus far. With the openings finalized, the doors are trimmed to their proper dimensions. And now, the sanding begins. Not to remove every imperfection, but simply to tone down several decades of pallet-related trauma. The varying colors, dents and rough texture are all intentionally preserved because apparently character is cheaper than hardwood. Unfortunately, the craftsman was not aiming for perfectly smooth. Otherwise, this process could have continued well into retirement. With the doors prepared, decorative trim pieces are now cut for the front. Equal parts structural reinforcement and, well, cheeky frontier saloon energy. The doors are then carefully positioned while the hinges are installed, and just like that, the cabinet doors officially become functional, which is lovely news for everyone involved. With the cabinet structure complete, attention now shifts to harvesting additional pallet wood for the exterior skin. Unfortunately, Euro pallets appear to have been engineered by deeply suspicious people. Despite what certain internet videos may suggest, these boards do not simply fall apart with a gentle tug and positive thinking. In reality, removing pallet boards often involves violence, power tools, and a fair amount of swearing under his breath. Eventually, the craftsman locates a pallet slightly less determined to defend itself. Nails are removed wherever possible, while others are simply negotiated with. Slowly, a usable collection of reclaimed boards begins to emerge. Each board is then trimmed to size before being arranged around the cabinet exterior. At this stage, the workshop floor officially disappears beneath a growing sea of pallet wood. One by one, the boards are secured into place, transforming the cabinet from a functional structure into something with a bit of personality. Even the base is carefully wrapped in matching pallet boards, because apparently we're committing fully to the rustic situation. And now, more sanding. Not enough to erase the history of the wood, just enough to remove several decades of workshop grime. Every board still carries its own scars, which is sort of the whole point, because perfection was never really the goal here. Character was. With the cabinet now fully clad, attention turns to the countertop, and suddenly things become considerably more sophisticated. Armed with a track saw and several imposing pieces of rough sawn hickory, the suburban woodworker begins, rather remarkably, to conduct himself like a proper craftsman. Clean, decisive cuts are made, while the natural live edge is intentionally preserved. A bold design choice, or possibly laziness disguised as rustic charm. Either way, the results are becoming difficult to argue with. The boards are then carefully aligned before being joined together to form the countertop. At this stage, patience is not merely a virtue. It is a requirement, because wood glue, it seems, will not be hurried, no matter how intently one stares at it. And for the first time in this build, the project begins to feel less like glorious workshop chaos and rather more deliberate. With the countertop now glued and cured, our craftsman is confronted with a rather inconvenient truth. The hickory slab is not entirely flat, which, to be fair, was perhaps expecting rather a lot from rough sawn lumber. And so, the router sled makes its grand entrance, a contraption specifically designed to remove tiny amounts of wood while producing absolutely unreasonable amounts of sawdust. Slow, deliberate passes are made across the surface, gradually revealing the grain hidden beneath the rough exterior. And with each pass, the contrast between dark heartwood and pale sapwood becomes more pronounced. The entire process is then repeated on the opposite side, because woodworking, it seems, consists primarily of doing everything twice. With the slab finally flattened, the countertop is trimmed to its finished dimensions, and rather impressively, it's beginning to look quite distinguished. Then comes the sanding, and yet more sanding. At this stage, the craftsman appears to enter a deeply meditative state. Either that, or he's lost consciousness. Initially, the live edge bark was intended to remain, which, in hindsight, was wildly optimistic. Eventually, the bark is carefully removed, and honestly, this was probably for the best. Beneath the surface, the wood reveals decades of wear, natural markings, and ancient worm trails. Details which, rather sensibly, have been left alone. And just like that, a rather handsome countertop emerges from what was, not long ago, a rough pile of lumber. With the countertop completed, attention now shifts to the upper shelf. Using another piece of rough sawn hickory, the craftsman begins shaping what will eventually become the final visual centerpiece of the coffee bar. And much like the rest of the project, there are no formal plans, only a constantly evolving series of decisions taking place entirely inside the craftsman's head. It's a fascinating process in which each completed step somehow reveals the next one. Fairly certain this is not how professionals operate. One rarely discussed aspect of projects like these is that they do not unfold in a single afternoon. Real life, unfortunately, continues interrupting the process. Families require attention. Work obligations persist, and occasionally the craftsman returns, dressed as though he's just come from a moderately aggressive family dinner. The underside is carefully flattened to ensure the shelf sits properly against the cabinet frame, while the upper surface is intentionally left slightly more natural, partly for grip and partly because the craftsman simply preferred the look of it. The live edge is then slowly refined, softening the roughness without removing the character underneath. A delicate balancing act between refinement and not sanding for the remainder of his natural life. By this stage, the sanding becomes less about shaping the wood and more about deciding when to finally stop. Meanwhile, somewhere inside the craftsman's mind, the next phase of the project is already beginning to take shape. With the shelf finally completed, attention can now shift to the coffee station backdrop. a feature which will require an entirely new level of pallet-related commitment. With the shelf completed, work can now begin on the coffee station backdrop. Unfortunately, this particular pallet proves far more cooperative than some of its predecessors. A welcome development for a man who has already spent an alarming amount of his natural life dismantling pallets. The remaining nails are then removed by hammer and grit in a process requiring patience, determination, and occasionally mild emotional resilience. Only once every nail has finally surrendered can construction properly begin. And here, the true irony of the project quietly reveals itself. The craftsman has dismantled an entire pallet in order to construct what will ultimately become a considerably more attractive pallet. With the framework assembled, the pallet boards are trimmed down and prepared for installation. Additional boards are then attached around the outer edges, helping give the backdrop a more finished appearance. One by one, the boards are glued and fastened into place. And slowly, the backdrop begins transforming from workshop materials into something far more intentional. Then, naturally, comes the sanding. Not to make everything perfectly smooth, just civilized enough to reduce the likelihood of accidental splinters during coffee preparation. At the last possible moment, the craftsman makes an additional design decision. A surrounding frame is added around the backdrop, because sometimes the difference between project and finished piece is one final moment of stubborn overachievement. And with that, the coffee station backdrop is complete. And for the first time, the project begins to display a certain dignified bearing. A confidence that feels, frankly, a touch presumptuous for something constructed from old shipping pallets. After an alarming quantity of sanding, the time has finally come for finish. A substance known to woodworkers by many affectionate names, polyurethane, clear coat, or, in certain workshops, bug spit. And almost immediately, the wood begins its transformation. The grain deepens, the colour warms, and the entire project suddenly begins looking considerably more expensive than its actual origins would suggest. Even the humble reclaimed pallet wood takes on a richer, more refined appearance, while still firmly refusing to become pretentious. But the true star of the moment is undoubtedly the hickory countertop. As the finish meets the surface, the grain all but erupts into view. With the upper sections now properly cured, attention returns once more to the cabinet itself. The doors and hardware are temporarily removed, allowing the finishing process to continue without interruption. Before any further finish can be applied, the surfaces must first be thoroughly cleaned. And so the craftsman sets about removing the persistent layer of dust left behind by several consecutive days of enthusiastic sanding. A task made considerably more challenging by the workshop's remarkable talent for generating fresh sawdust at all times. Meanwhile, the previously finished surfaces receive a gentle hand sanding. It's a slow but essential ritual intended to prepare the first coat for those that follow. Further evidence, really, that woodworking consists largely of performing the same task repeatedly, only with ever-increasing delicacy. With the surfaces prepared, additional coats of finish are carefully applied to the shelf, backdrop and countertop. And gradually, the wood begins to assume a noticeably richer and smoother character. Only now does the main cabinet finally receive its first coat of finish. And after weeks of dust, glue, sanding, and a considerable amount of pallet-related suffering, the entire project at last begins to speak with a single, coherent voice. With the finishing work now complete, attention shifts to assembly. Small mounting brackets are carefully installed inside the cabinet frame, preparing the structure for the countertop. A deceptively simple step, yet one that will determine whether the countertop sits with quiet dignity or rocks gently with every cup of coffee. The cabinet doors are then carefully rehung, using the hinges that had been removed earlier. And after a considerable amount of measuring, adjusting and thoughtful staring, the doors align rather respectably. A level is briefly consulted to maintain at least the appearance of professionalism. Pilot holes are then drilled for the cabinet hardware, allowing the newly finished doors to receive their cast iron handles. With the hardware complete, the hickory countertop is finally lowered into place. Careful adjustments are made to ensure the overhang remains pleasingly even on both sides. By this stage, the craftsman having grown strangely emotional about symmetry. The backdrop is then temporarily positioned, and, well, this is the moment where everything starts to come together, transforming the project from a collection of separate components into something that is beginning to resemble an actual coffee station. But naturally, the project cannot simply stop there. Additional holes are carefully drilled through the countertop and backdrop to accommodate what can only be described as an entirely unnecessary, yet deeply satisfying feature. A dedicated water system is now added to the station, complete with a discrete pump, hidden plumbing, and its own integrated supply. A hole is carefully drilled into the water container cap, allowing the supply line to pass through. The edges are cleaned up before a rubber grommet is installed to protect the tubing, and slowly, the coffee station begins drifting dangerously close to over-engineered. Fortunately, that appears to be precisely what the craftsman had in mind. With the final assembly complete, the project makes the rather perilous transition from chaotic workshop experiment to something that might actually belong inside a civilized home. One by one, the remaining pieces are installed. The shelves are dressed, the hardware returns, and slowly the coffee station begins to settle into its new environment. The hidden water reservoir is filled, bringing the station's unnecessarily elaborate plumbing system fully online. And rather impressively, it actually works. Now this is a moment that brings the craftsman an entirely unreasonable amount of satisfaction. What began as rough sawn hickory, dismantled pallets, and, well, a series of increasingly questionable decisions, has somehow evolved into this. A coffee station built through sheer stubbornness, generous amounts of improvisation, and, honestly, an almost concerning willingness to just keep sanding things. And there it is. The quiet satisfaction of turning a pile of scrap wood and vague internal debates into something that truly earns its place in the house. Though, judging by that expression, one strongly suspects the voices in his head are already planning the next absurd adventure.